Hey, Slider Crusaders, welcome to the show, and welcome to the very first day of the Hillary Clinton presidency. Congratulations, Hillary Clinton. You are now, because that's how it works, right? The president's impeached, and then it goes right to whoever lost in the previous election. And my understanding is that her swearing-in ceremony is later this evening. So congratulations to... I'm sorry, what's that? Oh, that's not how it works? Trump's still president. Okay, all right, never mind. Everything's the same. Nothing's changed at all. In fact, yesterday went pretty much exactly as planned. Maybe even a little more self-serving than I expected. Did we need 6 hours of every congressman giving their nauseating talking points about impeachment? And if you noticed, I watched way too much of it. The Republicans would get up there and they would say, Trump didn't do this, and he didn't do this, and here's the timeline, and here's what happened, and we have the transcript of this. And the Democrats would do this, oh, the long arc of history. What will our children say? Our founding fathers are weeping in their grave. And you can tell when someone's bloviating, when they go into this soaring rhetoric about a very specific thing that we're talking about. We're talking about very, like a detailed accusation, and we have the transcript. There's no need to do this broad, soaring rhetoric. A law enforcement friend of mine says that when someone's writing out their statement, if they're accused of a crime, they're writing out their statement about what happened that day, he says you can tell when they're lying because they all of a sudden get super vague. So they'll say, I woke up at 7:02 and I ate 3 eggs for breakfast, and I got in my Toyota Camry and I drove south on the highway for 32 minutes, and then I stopped someplace for a while, whatever. And then I came back home, and I had some spaghetti and meatballs. He's like, wait. You got pretty vague there. You can't yada, yada, yada over something like that. And that's what the Democrats said. I heretofore, whither whence henceforth, the sake of our republic demands. Come on, give me a break. Did you hear the congressman comparing Trump to Hitler? The worst of all was the guy, Kennedy, who wrote a letter to his children. Come on, a letter to my children. What a joke. Hours and hours and hours of that. But remember, yesterday was a very somber day. Very somber. Nancy Pelosi wore black because it was like a funeral. A funeral for our nation. And no one wants to do this. None of these Democrats, they don't want to be impeaching the president. It was really tough for them. And just an example for how hard it was for the Democrats to do this. Here was a very somber Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib.
Hey everyone, I am on my way to the United States House floor to impeach President Trump on behalf of my incredible district, 13 districts strong.
Oh yes, very, very somber, very tough for her to do that. Here's Pelosi after they approved the vote or whatever, and she hits the gavel, and some of the Democrats started to cheer. Look at what she did in response.
Article 1 is adopted. The question.
Wow, that's unbelievable. That's, I don't see anything like that, right? That's, do not look like we want this to happen. Do not look like we've been begging for this for 3 years. Do not look like we've done everything we can to manipulate this entire process to get to this moment. We're supposed to be somber. That, by the way, is the Nancy Pelosi behind the scenes. That's the Nancy Pelosi that has kept her in power for all these years. I've always wondered what that. Nancy Pelosi, she comes across like such a bumbling idiot. Same thing with Mitch McConnell, too. But these two people, they got to be nasty behind the scenes in order to keep power like she did. And I think you got a little glimpse of that with the duster. In all seriousness, so if you look back on George Washington's farewell address, he spoke about this. He gave a prophecy about what we're seeing right now, a dystopian one, a warning to us all. And I just want to read this quote right here. He said, the alternate domination of one faction over another, sharpened by the spirit of revenge, is itself a frightful despotism. But this leads at length to a more permanent despotism. The disorders and miseries which result gradually, so things get worse and worse, incline the minds of men to seek security and repose, peace, in the absolute power of an individual, a tyrant. And sooner or later, the chief of some prevailing faction, that tyrant, turns this disposition to the purposes of his own elevation on the ruins of public liberty. That's Washington's warning to us all. And we're having it right now. So the Democrats and Republicans are going back and forth, right? Sharpened by the spirit of revenge. And that's what this impeachment is. It's just the Democrats hating Trump. And then the next Democrat president is going to be impeached by the Republicans. And it's going to be the revenge back and forth and back and forth. And each time the revenge is going to get worse and worse. It's going to be more than just impeachment, but it's going to keep going. And Washington says this is bad enough, this revenge. But it gets worse because it leads to people seeking security from this madness, security from this chaos in a despot, in a tyrant. He says that's worse. This is why you got people in Africa and other places around the world, and they'll say, well, listen, we actually liked that tyrant better because at least he kept order around here. Right? That's people choosing peace and security over liberty. So let's simplify this. So in Washington's words, people are given three choices. You have liberty as the highest goal, right? That's Washington's vision. That's America's vision. That's what we're supposed to be, liberty. And then you have chaos. And then as Washington, I think, would argue, below that you have order, but order with an iron fist, order under the control of a tyrant. And he's saying too many people will choose order, even if it means being ruled under that iron fist. So again, our goal and Washington's goal was liberty. And right now we're spiraling to chaos. And he says, that's bad enough, that's regrettable enough, but it's going to get even worse. I think of it not too different than raising kids. I want my kids to have liberty. So in this analogy, this would be them playing together, right? I want everyone to be happy, everyone's sharing, taking turns, having fun. I got a 3-year-old, almost a 2-year-old. And then Jack takes Grace's toy. And then the whole system breaks down. The whole thing disintegrates into chaos. Everyone's crying, everyone's screaming. And if this happens over and over again, that's where we are right now in this analogy, by the way. Democrats and Republicans. Jack just stole Grace's toy and everyone's crying and screaming and freaking out. When this happens over and over again, a parent chooses one of two courses. They can either let it go and the kids live in a state of chaos forever and everyone's stealing toys and freaking out and crying all the time. Or it can turn the parent into a tyrant. When all we want is liberty. Just share your toys already, kids. I love it, Pete. We just want liberty. And that's what George Washington is saying. He's saying, get it together, people. Get past the factions. Have the disagreements, obviously. But revenge fueled by hatred and naked politics is not going to end well. It's going to end not only in chaos, it's going to end in tyranny. If we keep acting like a bunch of drunk fools hell-bent on revenge at all costs, it's going to get way worse than this. And that tyrant who's going to come to power, that's his last line, that tyrant who comes to power, he's going to do so on the ruins of public liberty. And I know there's some progressives watching now who are saying, yes, Slater, that's Trump. Trump's the tyrant. Come on. You're lacking perspective. Trump's not a tyrant. Obama wasn't a tyrant. You need a bit more historical perspective on what a tyrant is and what a tyrant can do and what people are capable of with absolute power and when they have a desperate people willing to hand over their liberty to them. We're not there yet. Washington saw all this coming, and we're not all the way there yet, but we're certainly well on our way. I want to, on that note, actually, I want to talk about catastrophizing in the next segment because that deserves a full analysis. So we'll just end here for now. What's Trump going to do with all this? What's he going to do with this? How is he going to turn this to his advantage? Because we said yesterday he will. Trump will be empowered by all of this. So he's going to do two things. First, watch what he did last night at his rally.
I just said to the First Lady, you're so lucky I took you on this fantastic journey. It's so much fun. They want to impeach you. They want to do worse than that. By the way, it doesn't really feel like we're being impeached, do you? The country is doing better than ever before. We did nothing wrong. We did nothing wrong. And we have tremendous support in the Republican Party like we've never had before. Nobody's ever had this kind of support.
That's great. So they're like, what impeachment? Impeachment? Who's impeached? What's the big deal? And then the second thing he's going to do is, it's going to be very effective. The Democrats didn't impeach me, Donald Trump. They impeached you. What a rallying cry that is. So Pelosi, I'm glad you wore black yesterday because it's like a funeral. What I think you don't yet realize is it's your funeral. Coming up, I want to talk about catastrophizing. We'll do it next. True story, Mike Slater. Hey, Slider Crusaders, welcome back. I want to talk about a part of this awesome book that you have to read, Coddling of the American Mind. It came out a couple years ago. Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff. It starts off talking about 3 untruths that are prevalent among young people today. And I want to talk about 2 of them. The first one is always trust your feelings. Always trust your feelings. That's the untruth. That's a prevalent thought among young people, is that you should always trust your feelings. And what? No, that's terrible, terrible advice. Epictetus said thousands of years ago, he said, what really frightens and dismays us is not external events themselves, but the way in which we think about them. It's not things that disturb us, but our interpretations of their significance. His point is, our decisions are the result of our thought patterns, and our thought patterns are almost always negative. Negative thoughts lead to negative thought patterns, lead to negative decisions, and a bad life outcome. So there's a couple ways we do this. We'll roll through a couple of these real fast. So we have emotional reasoning. So this is when you say, I feel anxious, therefore the situation must be dangerous. And you're like, oh, well, maybe it's not dangerous. Like, don't let your emotions dictate that reality. People overgeneralize, and they say, oh, I always fail at everything I do. It's like, oh, well, that's a lot. You have dichotomous thinking, very all or nothing. Nobody ever wants to hang out with me. Mind reading, this is probably the one I do the most. Like, oh, this person hates me, or my boss thinks I'm a terrible employee because of this. And then you go reacting based off of this thought that you completely made up yourself. That's not really your mind reading, and then you base your thoughts on. Like, that doesn't make any sense. We do it all the time. There's another one, negative filtering. So it's only looking at the bad part of a situation. So you look at all the people who don't like me. Okay, but look at all the people. What about the people who do? Right? But there's a bunch of those. But the one that's most relevant here to this impeachment stuff and just our politics in general is catastrophizing. So it's focusing on the worst possible outcome and seeing it as the most likely one. So if I fail this test, I'll never get a job and I'll never be successful, right? Just the worst case scenario. And maybe you've done this if you've ever been sick before, or my buddy the other day got his tonsils taken out and he was 2 days in and he's like, I'll never swallow again. It's like, all right, you'll probably swallow, but you see how we spiral real fast with those thoughts. Probably if you have any, we talked about this yesterday, 2 days ago, there's probably a lot of 17-year-olds who are catastrophizing this last weekend when they didn't get into their college of choice for early admission. My life is over, I'll never be successful, never. So we catastrophize in politics all the time. Or I should say the media catastrophizes all the time. You see it with their headlines, right? Like, presidency in peril. Everything's historical. The walls are closing in. The beginning and the end. His final days. Like, all this is crazy. Just all hardcore all the time. And it never is. The walls have been closing in for 3 years. These have been his final days for 3 years. It's never the end. They just need they need to keep you desperately on the edge of your seat to find out what happens next. And people haven't figured it out. Nothing will happen next. This impeachment will go to the Senate, it'll be over in 2 minutes, and nothing will come of this. Nothing will come of historical impeachment proceedings. So try not to get caught up in people trying to catastrophize everything. They're manipulating you. They're manipulating your emotions in order to manipulate your thoughts and then therefore your actions. Don't play their game. And both sides do it, right? Yesterday you had Republican congressmen comparing this impeachment to Pilate and Jesus. It's like, geez, guys. There's a reference to Pearl Harbor. And then you had a Democrat comparing Trump to Hitler. Like, come on. What's wrong with everyone? I saw a Jesse Kelly tweet. He said, like, these people must think we're just total idiots, or at least they are. Stop doing this. We've lost all nuance and lost all clear thinking, and just everything's got to be just bludgeoned in our face nonstop all the time. Breaking news. It was like a year or so ago. I said, I'm not going to lose my mind every day. That's what they want you to do. They want you to lose your mind every single day. And no, I'm not playing that game. You saw a little bit of it this weekend. I know I'm a little late to the party here, but with the Army-Navy game, right? All this outrage for like 10 hours of the kid who displayed the white power hand symbol. I remember the first thing I read, the very first comment I read about it, it was someone on Twitter saying, these kids need to be dishonorably discharged and they need to pay back every cent that we paid to train them. It was just full on. And it's true on Twitter all the time and online everywhere, but everyone just assumes the worst about everything all the time. And all this catastrophizing, it's all an act. It's all an act. I'll give you an example. Have you ever thought, what happened to those child internment camps that we had at our border? Do you remember? Remember we had Nazi-style concentration camps. I'm in San Diego, so like 20 miles south of where I'm sitting right now, we had Nazi-style concentration camps, ripping children from women's arms. It was the greatest travesty, the greatest human rights violation in human history. What happened? What happened to it? Did it go away? Have these camps been liberated by a foreign army? Have the Russians marched in and liberated these people? Where did it all go? Where did the crisis go? Oh, it was never a crisis to begin with. It was almost completely made up with the most extreme images and rhetoric that anyone could conceive in order to manipulate your emotions to make Trump and you seem like the worst person on the planet. Oh, weird. Worst case scenarios, assuming the worst of motives to the point of accusing West Point cadets of being white supremacists. Always making people fearful of the worst. I think the pinnacle of this is from time to time, someone will say that they're fearful that Trump's not going to leave office if he loses his next election. He'll be dictator forever. Come on. It's the old H.L. Mencken quote. The whole aim of practical politics is to keep the populace alarmed and hence clamorous to be led to safety. That's what George Washington was talking about in the last segment. Same thing. By an endless series of hobgoblins, most of them imaginary. You want to rank this year's hobgoblins? I think Russian collusion and this whole Ukraine phone call are near the top of that list. We'll share the second great untruth next. True story. Mike Slater, spread the word. Hey, Slater Crusaders, welcome back. This is exactly what we were just talking about. Trump just tweeted this out on his Instagram and Twitter. This is Trump bringing the tribe closer together, right? Telling his tribe that we're under attack, unite, and don't let them win. It's a brilliant move, which leads to the second untruth that's in this book, The Coddling of the American Mind. And that is that a lot of people believe that life is a battle between good people and evil people. That life is a battle between good people and evil people. I think there is good and evil, no doubt about it, right? When Jesus told Peter, "Get behind me, Satan," I don't believe he was calling Peter Satan. I think he was talking to Satan, who was using Peter's worldly thoughts to tempt Jesus. But that didn't make Peter an evil person. And it's true with our daily interactions as well. We think there's good people and bad people. And in politics, we go to the extreme of good people and bad people. And I don't think that's necessarily true. And it just makes everything a catastrophe, as we talked about in our last segment. It makes the stakes way higher than they need to be. Now, it makes sense that we do this because we are wired for tribalism. I want to talk about that a little bit here because we talk about this a lot on our show. I think it's fundamental to understanding politics today. Absolutely fundamental. You want to make sense of the craziness that's going on today, you got to understand tribalism. So I have two studies here that they talk about in this book to prove how wired we are for tribal thinking. The first is from a psychologist named Henri Tajfel. So this guy served in the French army during World War II. He was a POW in Germany. His entire family was murdered in Poland by the Nazis for being Jewish. So this guy was understandably obsessed with answering the question, how could otherwise good, normal, decent people do such horrible things to each other and do horrible things to their neighbors? So he set up many experiments. There was one in particular in the 60s, and he divided people into two groups based on the most meaningless and arbitrary ways possible, like flipping a coin. Right? So he'd flip a coin and say, all right, you're heads, you're in the heads group, you're tails, you're in the tails group. Right? In one version of the study, he had people guess the number of dots on a piece of paper. And it didn't even matter what they said. He put one group over there and called them the overestimators. And then he put another group over there and called them the underestimators. Okay, and it was totally random, didn't mean anything. Then he had everyone distribute money to other people or he had certain people distribute money to everyone else in the experiment. And he found that no matter how trivial, or in his words, minimal, he made the distinction between the groups, right? Heads group over there, tails group over there. No matter how minimal he made the distinction, people tended to distribute money or points or whatever they were told to distribute more to people in their in-group. Right? So this shows how wired we are for tribal allegiance, even if the allegiance is based off of nothing. Nothing. Something as flimsy and meaningless as, oh, you're in the heads group? Me too. I'm in the heads group as well. What? I'll never forget this analysis from Adam Carolla. Years ago, I heard this. And he was talking about skin color. And skin color is the default thing we use to analyze our tribal membership. It's the default thing because it's the easiest to see, right? So that's why people are obsessed with it, because it's the easiest to see. So his example was, if you're watching a boxing match, and you got a black guy versus a white guy boxing, he said black people are going to root for the black guy, white people are going to root for the white guy. Right? That's just the basic knee-jerk default reaction. I'm white, he's white, black, that doesn't, right? But then, as soon as you find out, let's say you're white, as soon as you find out that black guy went to your high school, oh, you're obviously going to root for the black guy now. Like that's, of course you're going to root for him, because now you have a new tribal association. And really, any connection to that black boxer will trump whatever default super shallow tribal connection you have based off of skin color. If you went to the same high school, if you're from the same state, certainly if you're from the same country, right? Let's say the black guy's from America and he's fighting a white guy from Russia or whatever. Like, obviously you're going to vote for the black guy now, right? And it could be anything. It truly doesn't matter what the connection is. Anything trumps skin color association. Skin color association is just that default because it's the easiest to see. But again, the point is our brains are wired to establish tribes. And this is all politics has become. I'll give you one more study. So some neuroscientists, they hooked people up to an MRI machine and they watched their brain reactions. And the people who are hooked up to the MRI, they watched videos of people's hands, people's fingers, getting pricked by either a needle or a Q-tip. So they would take, let's say, take a Christian guy, put him in the machine, the MRI machine, and if this person was watching a video of a Christian's finger get poked with a needle, then that person's brain went crazy. They felt more pain because they were watching someone in their tribal group experience pain. You're thinking, okay, well, that's a deep membership, right? We're fellow Christians, we're brothers. Okay, so they did it again. But this time, they flipped coins to divide people into groups. Just like we talked about in the last experiment. And they say, oh, you're in the heads group and you're in the tails group. So they had someone who's in the heads group get in the MRI machine, and they watched a video of someone who was also in the heads group get their finger pricked. And their brains went crazy just the same. Because, oh, well, that's someone in my tribe. What tribe? The people who flipped heads a second ago? Oh, that's your tribal membership? That ridiculous tribal membership that was established like 5 minutes ago? But that's how wired we are for it. Now, it's good to belong to a tribe. Tribe is what gives you trust and purpose and meaning and unity and a feeling of contribution. There's a lot of good things. But the flip side is that it's easier to other people from a different tribe. And then we tend not to see the problems within our own tribe. The term is, it binds and blinds. So a tribe makes us bound to each other, which is good, but it often makes us also blinded to our own problems. This is why, again, to bring it back to politics, this is why the Trump-Ukraine president phone call, if you're in the Democratic tribe, it's the worst thing you've ever seen. It's the worst phone call. So on a severity scale, 0 to 10, 10 being the Democrats are 10. They're, it's a threat to the Republic's future, right? It's the worst phone call ever. And if you're in the Trump tribe, it's a 0. It's the greatest phone call that's ever been made. Now, objectively, really, it's like a 2, the phone call. It's not impeachable. It's certainly not the worst ever. It's not impeachable even. But it's not a 0. It's not nothing, right? He mentions Biden. It's probably not great, right? So it's like a 2. But you can't look at it objectively. And I know people are going to send me emails being like, oh, why is it even a 2, Slater? You're in the bag for the Democrats. Like, no, that's my point. We can't look at things objectively anymore because we only look at things through our tribal lens. And that's not good. So, in conclusion to all of this impeachment talk today, try not to catastrophize everything or really just don't listen to other people who are. It's almost always people who are just trying to play with your emotions, or they lack historical perspective themselves and they're losing their minds, and that's not someone you want to follow either. Also, try not to look at people as good people or bad people. Right or wrong policies, absolutely. But not good or bad people. George Washington warned us about that. Coming up next, we're going to talk about that, I would say Supreme Court case, but the Supreme Court decided not to take it, about homelessness in Boise. We'll talk with a lawyer who was behind that on, I'd say, the good side. This is a good example, though, this homelessness. Are the people who, in this battle of homelessness, in this court case, good people, bad people? Or, I would argue, very, very misguided people? We'll talk about that next. True story, Mike Slater. Spread the word. Hey, Slater Crusaders, welcome back. We talk a lot about homelessness on this show, and we do it from lots of different perspectives. I'd like to highlight the people who are doing good work and fighting for truth, and also fighting to help the people who are homeless. That's the main point here. So someone who's doing it from the legal side is Elizabeth Mitchell, who's lawyer for the International Downtown Association, who's had a very busy week. Ms. Mitchell, how are you?
I'm good. How are you doing, Mike?
Wonderful. So everyone heard the headlines the other day about the Supreme Court not taking a case, Boise versus Martin Robert et al. Tell us first, I don't know where to begin. Let's go to the very beginning. What's the law in Boise?
Sure. The law in Boise is that if there is a shelter bed available, then you must use it. and they have a law similar to what we have here in Los Angeles, which prohibits sleeping and laying down on sidewalks. But they have a policy that if there are no shelter beds, that they won't enforce that law. But if there are shelter beds available, then they will enforce the law. In the Boise case, the Martin v. Boise case in particular, there was an encampment that had become dangerous and unhealthy. And so the officials there decided to clear the encampment, and they offered all of those folks shelter beds to use. They didn't want to use them for various reasons. And that's where we're at. So that it was that law.
Yeah, what's the problem with that? I haven't heard anything like challengeable there so far.
Right. It sounds very reasonable, right, to all of us, I think, that are having this conversation. What they alleged was that the beds, they didn't like the beds. The beds were not reasonably available to them. For example, one of them didn't want to go to a religious institution, and the only bed that was available was a place that required prayers before dinner and had crosses on the wall and that kind of thing. Another one, there were issues with timing. I think he was timed out. He had spent 3 weeks and had to wait a certain period of time before he went back to another shelter. There were various issues. And we see that here a lot in Los Angeles, where, somebody has a pet and they don't want, they don't want to be separated from their pet or from their spouse or from their myriad of belongings. And so there's always issues with these shelters. So their solution is just, no, I'm not going to go to a shelter. I'm going to stay here in the tent on the sidewalk.
Okay, so you say they. Who's the they? Is like the ACLU, or who's the one critical of this law that says you can't live on the street, you have to go into a shelter bed?
Right. It's it's the ACLU, it's Legal Aid, it's a lot of these what they call themselves activists, homeless activists, and I'll use that phrase for lack of a better term. But the reality is that fighting for the right for someone to die on the street, I don't want to call them I don't want to even give them the glory of calling them an activist, because I think they're doing them a disservice.
Yeah, you're the activist. You're the activist trying to help people.
Right.
Wow. Okay. All right. So that's the law. They challenged it, and then walk us through the courts that it went through and what they each said that ultimately led to the Supreme Court.
So, what ended up happening is there were several appeals, actually, this case. The case is a decade old, so it went to the Ninth Circuit twice, I think. But in this particular one, they challenged the law itself as applied to these to Robert Martin and his cohorts. So in the Ninth Circuit, a court actually ruled that you cannot enforce that law, the sleeping on the sidewalk laws or those type of laws, unless you have a bed that is, and I want to say the exact phrase is reasonably available. And the court decided that when a person doesn't want to pray before dinner and so doesn't want to use that shelter bed is not reasonably available to them. And so the problem with this, and it's, I think in theory, the idea that you need to have a bed for a person, or at least a place for them to go before you can enforce the law, I think we can all agree in theory that's actually a good idea. It doesn't make any sense. If you don't have a place for them to go, how are you going to arrest them for sleeping on the sidewalk? What else are they going to do? But if they do have a place to go, they should be required to go there, or at least not sleep on the sidewalk. The problem with the Boise decision is, one, the reasonably available language is incredibly vague. That can be extended to a whole number of complaints. But the other issue is they made some very inconsistent determinations, and it appears as though one of the sweeping rulings they made was that unless you have enough beds for everyone in the entire jurisdiction, then you cannot enforce the law as to anyone. And that is incredibly sweeping. When you look at, again, I'm in Los Angeles, so this is my point of reference. In Los Angeles County, we have 60,000 homeless folks here on the streets every single night. We do not have 60,000 shelter beds. What we have, we have encampments I'm sure you've heard of or seen pictures of Skid Row here in Los Angeles. We also have a ton of encampments throughout the city and the county. So what this law does is it really ties the hands of our municipalities to deal with those. If they have a particularly difficult encampment that they're trying to clear for fire danger or other purposes, and they have a place for them to go, let's say they have 50 shelter beds, under Boise is completely unclear if they can enforce that law and try to clear out the encampment and get these folks to help.
Wow.
There are
What's
some-
a
what's a
police? Sorry, what's a police officer to do when you have a law that's
Right.
like basically minute to minute, right? So at one moment it's the law, and then we're all full. Now it's not the law anymore. How is that functional at all?
It doesn't. You know, I actually represented police officers in civil suits for about a decade before I went to the private sector. And it is very difficult for them. I mean, I think in New York, you have 30,000 police officers. Here in Los Angeles, we have 10,000 in LAPD and maybe 20,000 in the county. When you look at that number of folks, I mean, they're not legal scholars. You know, they're for the very mass majority of them, really well-intentioned people who are trying to follow the law. And when you have laws that bounce back and forth like this, especially something so vague as Boise, it's very difficult for them to, on the street level, really have a grasp on what they're supposed to do. And what this does is it leads to complaints and lawsuits for them. I mean, it's a really difficult situation for law enforcement, for sure.
Where do you see this idea reasonably available? Where do you see that headed? Because you said the one person said, I don't like it because you have to pray before. Like, would you see reasonably available, maybe a homeless person saying, oh, well, I don't want to go to that bed because it's whatever, right? It's 2 blocks away, or right? I mean, how do you see the idea of reasonably spiraling to nothing?
Right. It's really hard to wrap our heads around. And it's something that we were, frankly, all shocked that the Supreme Court didn't pick this up, because the decision, not only is the decision just based on completely faulty legal reasoning, but it's also really confusing and inconsistent. And there's no way to apply it across the board for municipalities. So it can devolve very quickly, just depending on how people interpret it. And the problem is, however a city wants to interpret it, let's say a city wants to interpret it narrowly, it's going to be litigation. This whole thing is going to, this is like a blessing for lawyers, because what's going to happen is cities are going to interpret it certain ways, and it's going to be fought. There's going to be a lawsuit. There's going to be huge fights in court, and we're going to see this throughout the Ninth Circuit. There's 1,600 municipalities that all have to figure out how they're going to grapple with this. It's difficult.
Yes. So is that why you're surprised the Supreme Court didn't take it and just sort of settle it once and for all? What do you think? What's your theory as to why they didn't take it?
There's a lot of theories being bandied about. One of them is that the basic tenet of the Ninth Circuit's decision is that this law was criminalizing the status of a person's being, which is prohibited against by the Eighth Amendment. So, by way of example, a Supreme Court 60, 70 years ago struck down a law that prohibited the act of being an alcoholic, right? If you are an alcoholic, that's against the law. Well, you can't prohibit a person's status. What you can do is regulate their behavior. And so the Ninth Circuit made this call that somehow sleeping on the sidewalk laws is related to a person's status as opposed to their conduct, right? Their status as being homeless. So that,
but I would argue their behavior is sleeping on the sidewalk, right?
That's conduct. That's not status. We're not criminalizing homeless for being homeless. We're criminalizing the act of sleeping on the sidewalk, especially when there is a place for you to go. This is when we say it's twisted legal logic. It didn't make sense. But so one of the theories is that the Supreme Court took a look at it and said, well, yeah, this doesn't criminalize conduct. We know the Eighth Amendment doesn't criminalize conduct, so we're not going to take it up because we don't have an issue with it. I don't agree with that theory. I don't think it makes a lot of sense. Because it was such twisted logic and the decision was so twisted. I think a more judicious reading, frankly, and what other people are saying, which I didn't think about when we were leading into this, is there's so much going on with the Supreme Court with President Trump right now. You have the impeachment hearings that Justice Robert actually has to preside over. You have these various subpoenas and things that there's a lot of talk that maybe the Supreme Court just felt they needed more bandwidth and couldn't take
Wow.
cases.
Yeah, that'd be a
I don't know.
shame.
I don't know. It's disappointing
li-
because we didn't. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was just, we got to take a very quick break. Can you stick around for just a few more minutes?
Sure, no problem.
I want to ask you about what you think the progressive mindset is when it comes to homelessness and sort of their worldview that would cause someone to think like they are, and then talk about what your vision for this is. So we'll talk more with Elizabeth Mitchell coming up next on True Story. Mike Slater. We're talking with Elizabeth Mitchell, who represents the International Downtown Association, which was in support of the Boise law that should have gone to the Supreme Court, but the Supreme Court denied to hear it, and now it's just going to be a giant mess for every city across the country. People who want to help homeless people, I believe, actually help them.
Right.
Elizabeth, what's your perspective on the mindset of, I guess maybe the people on the Ninth Circuit who made this ruling, or the other lawyers on the other side? What's their perspective on homelessness, and what motivates them, do you think?
That's a really great question. I have litigated against these folks for over a decade when I was working for the city of Los Angeles. And I really think they believe that people have the right to live and die on the streets, and that that's their choice. And if their choice is to, fall into a gutter, then that's their civil liberty to do so. And I think it is such a backwards mindset, because somehow that narrative has been controlled. Like somehow compassion is not arresting homeless or not trying to utilize the tools we have to get them services and get them help that they need. It's really unfortunate. Letting somebody die on the street in the name of compassion is not compassionate. And so in my opinion, it's completely backwards.
Yeah, compassion literally means to suffer alongside. And letting someone take drugs and die, that's literally the opposite. You're just pushing them aside into the gutters. Gosh, it's so awful. So what do you think about the Thomas Sowell analysis? He wrote in Vision the Anointed that progressives think that criminals and also homeless people are victims. So they're victims of society, so we need to protect the victims and therefore let them do whatever. Have you thought about that?
I have not thought about that quote specifically, but I think it's absolutely right on. They're viewed as victims of society, and therefore we should, let them do whatever they want because we feel bad for them. It's really the opposite. It's really the opposite, I think, of reason. Because when you turn around and say, we're going to let you do whatever you want, you're really allowing people to suffer even greater than they already are. So it's really unfortunate.
So let's contrast that with your vision. Why are you so inspired by this, and why do you dedicate your life to this?
So, because I see what's happening on my streets every day, and it is awful. As I mentioned, I worked for the city of Los Angeles for over a decade, and I just watched this city crumble from the inside as a result of these narratives that are being controlled in the courts. The Boise case is just the latest of a whole string of lawsuits that we've had here in the Ninth Circuit. And you look at the actual impact in Portland, in Seattle, in Los Angeles, in San Francisco. These are places that are overrun. And it breaks my heart, because I am a person, I have worked my whole life in homeless shelters. I have volunteered, I have served meals. These are real people to me. These aren't victims, these are people that are capable of, for the most part, picking themselves up by their bootstraps and moving on. But I think they are being held down, and it's heartbreaking to me. So when folks approached me about 9 months ago after I left the city and asked me how can we really address this issue in a greater way, because we're frustrated with how the city is addressing this and how the narrative is being controlled by one side, I said, absolutely, I'm happy to do it. So I represented International Downtown Association in the Boise case. I'm also representing a group called LA Alliance for Human Rights. Because we believe that it is a human rights issue when you have people, walking like zombies down the street with their pants around their ankles, and everybody is just walking past them. It's heartbreaking. They need help. They don't need to just lay there on sidewalks. And so that's where we started picking this up, and we're working on filing a lawsuit against the city and the county to really try to come alongside our policymakers, frankly, and affect real change and get people shelter beds, FEMA-style emergency shelter beds immediately. That's our only choice left after Boise.
Yeah, I'm grateful for your heart for this, right? Because I think that's the best answer. The answer can't be, well, it's bad for business to have homeless people on the streets. Like okay, it is, but that's not the point. It's so much more than that. And I'm grateful that you are fighting this, combating this from the legal side, right? There's a lot of people that need to be doing this from different angles, and I'm grateful you're doing it from the legal side because
Thank you.
there's not enough. So, Liz Mitchell, thank you very much for being here. We'll talk again.
Absolutely. Thanks, Mike.
Thank you, man. Appreciate it. Elizabeth Mitchell right there. This Ninth Circuit. We'll talk another day about Trump changing the makeup of the Ninth Circuit, which is pretty wild. But thanks so much for being here today. Mike Slater, True Story. Spread the word. See you tomorrow.